Whenever I speak in a Victorian Studies gathering, I'm aware of the tremendous energy of the field and the outstanding figures that exist in it, and to whom I'm always grateful. So why do I speak of reinventing the novel of the long 19th century? It's because I've become intensely aware of the discrepancy between teaching the novel and reading criticism of it, something that's become something of an obsession with me. To read the novel with students is to engage with a linguistic and narrative excitement and experiment, to encounter a literary form of sophistication, subtlety, social depth, and political alertness. To turn to criticism of the novel is to feel the atmosphere grow heavy. Heavy with an ideological pessimism that presupposes the default mode of the novel must be conservative. Franco Moretti calls the novel the symbolic form of the bourgeois nation-state. Frederick Jameson believes that the realist novel, a great critic, believes that the realist novel has an ontological commitment to the status quo as such. He writes that the cultural logic of realism has an aesthetic need to avoid recognition of deep structural social change as such, and of the deeper currents and contradictory tendencies within the social order. The radical possibilities of the novel, what makes us see the world differently, I believe, are systematically underread. The Marxist critics I've quoted believe that the novel indelibly registers the constraints of bourgeois ideology and morality, but such disavowal characterizes much criticism. Those writers, such as Elaine Hadley, for instance, who read the novel through what she terms liberal cognition. That this work is often brilliant makes it all the more problematical. I'd be happy to say more about this critical constellation outside the talk, but I can't say much more about it now. I'm aware that there are wonderful exceptions, the work of the late Sally Ledger, for instance. At a recent BAVS conference, I spoke of our tendency to see the novel as a symptom of history, another manifestation of the way readings of the novel are circumscribed. Today, I want to ask how the default conservative reading that drains brio and energy from our criticism can be undone. A great work of art, Adorno said, lets those things be heard which ideology conceals. I want to look at 4 principles, 4 ways of reading, strategies of reading the novel that let those things be heard, that show the novel asking radical questions. But first, we will not do this unless we credit the novel with critical self-consciousness. Ideology does not go on behind its back. Just briefly, consider the novel's dealings with genealogy, an invariant component of the 19th century narrative, so common that we forget it, we're barely conscious of it. Genealogical construction outside the novel, in the 19th century in particular, but always, with its emphasis on male lineage and primogeniture, is an elaborate social artifice. For the fiction writer, its constructedness must have been apparent. It cannot be naturalized. 2 short examples. Here is just an extract from Thackeray's scintillating deconstructive Sport with the titles of the Marquis of Steyne, a parody of Debrett and Burke, an extravaganza that depends on juxtaposing actual and absurd titles, that plays, therefore, with the very idea of entitlement, not a chain of signifiers, but an arbitrary list. I'm cutting this here, it's much longer in the original. It's just an extract. A knight of the most noble order of the Garter, of the Golden Fleece of Spain, of the Russian Order of St. Nicholas, First Lord of the Powder Closet, and groom of the back stairs, colonel of the Gaunt or Regent's Own Regiment of Militia, and this will be dear to our hearts, a trustee of the British Museum. Genealogical critique can take the subtlest form. With 2 words in the first sentence of Mansfield Park, good luck, Jane Austen unsettles both the idea of the entitlement to aristocratic lineage and meritocracy. About 30 years ago, Miss Maria Ward of Huntingdon, with only £7,000, had the good luck to captivate Sir Thomas Middleton, and to be thereby raised to the rank of baronet's lady. What she's saying is that class is a lucky accident. To my 4 principles then. I'll just describe them briefly and then I'll go on to say something about each of them one by one. First, I want to make an analogy between the experiments of the novel and the exploratory Enlightenment inquiry, the discursive form that coincides historically with the genesis of the novel and that moves in parallel with it. For to see the novel in this way is to see it as an open-ended structure that precludes the necessity of reading backwards from endings. Endings are rarely resolutions, more often improvised contrivances. Second, radical inquiry is signalled through the poetics of form when the text jolts or disrupts realist conventions. In fact, I shall be suggesting that we need a moratorium on realism just now. Third, rather than the Bildungsroman, the narrative of individual success and self-overcoming, we need to look at the dispossessed and the spaces of the dispossessed in the novel. Lastly, I cannot think of a 19th century novel that does not introduce art and aesthetic work. The critical presence of the aesthetic in the text is a crucial aspect of the radical and experimental imagination. So I'll begin with the novel as inquiry. The philosophical inquiry, one, I think, of the forms of modernity, is an open form. It starts from questions. The philosophical inquiry genre is continuously exploratory. It asks its readers to think in terms of hypotheses. Likewise, inquiry in the novel is continuous with the narrative and indeed creates inquiry through narrative process. Like its discursive counterpart, it has a brief to look searchingly and purposefully at questions and their repercussions as a problematic which may have contradictory logics. Thus, it's multi-perspectival. The importance of seeing the novel as inquiry is that the stress is on questioning and not on finite problem solving. Questions are not simply open-ended, not simply the production of emporia. A question frames the terms in which it might be answered. Questions open up the implications of assent or denial to their interrogatives. Of course, inquiries have an agenda, but this is an evolving, not a preordained thought process. To stress the exploratory nature of the inquiry is to get away from the notion that the novel should offer resolutions, political or otherwise. As a species of inquiry, I take one of the most disputed and painful cruxes in the 19th century novel, and which feminists agonize over: the presence of the Creole Bertha in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. Is the violent racism of the Angrian sagas carried over into that snarling animal in the text? Is Jane's success bought at the cost of a demonizing colonial violence to which Rochester's wife is subjected? But the text itself, I think, is asking questions, related questions, but slightly different questions. The relation between Bertha and Jane, questions about that and their entitlements. In order to do so, it correlates the two women through the dream work erotics of the Thornfield sections and the more documentary elements of the first part of the novel by calibrating their names and the facts of assault, violence, and imprisonment. Heir in the sense of being heir to, with the corollary of class. Bertha, I've always wondered why that homely name was given to Rochester's wife. Bertha, birth, with the corollary of race. What legitimates a woman as an heir? Birth and class? What makes a woman's birth meaningful in society? Heirship, but not race? Jane and Bertha are analogues of one another, drawn together through beds, the place of procreation, the ancestral bed of the Red Room, the bed in the third floor room where Mason lies savaged and bleeding. Both Jane and Bertha are assaulted and imprisoned. Jane, first by John, and then wrestled by Bessie and Miss Abbott, like a mad cat. Lend me your garters, she would break mine directly. I love the way that violence has that comedy associated with it, the thought of the buxom Miss Abbott having to take off her garters. Bertha is, of course, wrestled by Mason and Rochester. Jane's blood is drawn, Bertha draws blood. Rochester has an extraordinary need to isolate and torture the woman he associates with. Jane reacts to oppression with sadomasochistic pliancy, Bertha with violence. Now, this parallel has often drawn ethical conclusions from critics. To put it crudely, Jane good, Bertha bad, and that's what worries so many feminist critics in particular. But isn't another type of inquiry going on, another set of questions? What happens to the subject when it is dehumanized and when oppression is carried so far that the psyche collapses? In Jane's case, it's a near destruction of her identity followed by mutilating repression that disavows hatred. In Bertha's, it is violence and hatred, revolutionary and racial violence, if you like. It's by drawing those two things together, weighing them against one another, thinking them through, I think, the text is trying to relate Jane and Bertha. I think these questions ask questions in turn about the limited analyses made by Rochester and Jane herself. The second principle, we are alerted to experiment and radical thinking by generic jolts or formal narrative surprises, where the poetics of form deliberately flouts the principles of realism and allows the novel to experiment beyond its constraints. Now, a simple, very oversimplified definition of realism would be to say that it is a narrative finding a language that attempts to be commensurate with lived experience of time-space outside the novel. Realism is a necessary postulate for the novelist, but at one and the same time, it is one from which she constantly departs, as experiment affirms there is no universal and uniform real. Think of the extraordinary split narrative of Eliot's Daniel Deronda, where the mytho-poetic language of the Jewish side of the novel cohabits with the psychological realism of the Gwendolen narrative. That's a very obvious example. There are much more interesting other ones, I think. Think of Dickens's Bleak House, not only the double narrative, first and third person, but the multiple defamiliarizing conventions of the grotesque, the Beckett-like misflight, for example, spontaneous combustion, that coexist with Esther's inwardness. Think again of Jane Eyre. How can we possibly accept the sleepwalking happenings of the Thornfield sections in the terms of realist fiction? And also Jane's prim obtuseness to Rochester's sexual advantages. You'd think she must have known what he was at. Those Thornfield episodes have a different, I think, and brilliantly inventive agenda, and that is to find imagery to make the unconscious speak in its success and its contradictions. Desire, longing, travesty, masquerade, inversion. Jane is early fascinated by the change of perspective in Gulliver's Travels. The miniature and exact modulates to the monstrous and gigantesque. The documentary Bildung, pre-Thornfield, modulates into dreamwork and its complexities. I can say later how I think the workings out are occurring, but I have to leave it there for the moment. It has become the norm for almost all critics of the 19th century narrative to speak of the realist novel. I think you must all have noticed that. The definite article embalms and atrophies the novel genre in a way that diverts thought into endless definitions and generates the equally reified categories of the Gothic and the sensation novel for those texts that don't fit and must be expelled from the realist zone. Realism, Gothic, sensation have become explanatory categories rather than terms to be investigated. Of course, there is a colossal and distinguished literature on realism reaching back into history, but even the most searching critics today resist seeing it as a convention among others. I think because they long for some form of extra-linguistic real, so they want to hang on to the definite article as a way of ensuring this. the constructedness of fictional conventions is somehow not allowed to realism. It's not seen as a convention among other conventions. A very thorough recent survey of works on Victorian realism in the latest number of Victorian Literature and Culture identifies telegraphic realism, photographic realism, sympathetic realism, through Adam Smith's reading of Sympathy, global realism, cosmopolitan realism, urban realism as categories of the realist novel. A range of epithets so diverse that realism loses its content. The epithets don't really need the noun. The article also discusses Jameson's The Antinomies of Realism, returns again to the problem of realism, which assumes realism is doomed by its inner nature. But why should realism be the defining category of the novel? Why should it not be a convention among others? That is why we need a moratorium on realism and the realist novel, to clear a space for something else, perhaps a mode of inquiry that will not assume an epistemological break between the 19th century and modernism. My third principle, the novel's deep concern with the dispossessed, not simply an aspect of the culture of charity and 19th century philanthropy. The outcast is always associated with social space and its humanly made boundaries. Jane Eyre, for instance, alone and starving on the moors after fleeing Thornfield, envisages the moors as a place of existential freedom for the lost and destitute, but finds that they are dominated space. She dreads that some sportsman or poacher might discover me, the antithetical occupants of owned land. She is still in socially made space. Dispossession is humanly made. Consider Joe, the crossing sweeper in Bleak House, establishing the boundaries of pollution and dirt, matter out of place, to use Mary Douglas's terms. He is at the same time a taboo subject, the agent of pollution, even as he clears it, outside the social boundaries he helps to keep in place. Hegel thought of England as the country of all European nations that created the deficit subject and its destitution, arguing that the economics of Smith and Ricardo, based on creating and satisfying artificial needs, presumed all subjects as subjects in need, subjects of need, a deficit subject, subjects in lack. Joe epitomizes the ultimate destitution of such a subject. I argue that the novel explores the deficit subject to resist it. It's one of the fundamental positions, I think, of any 19th century novel you might read. Finally, and possibly most important of all, the presence of aesthetic work in the novel. From the cameos and medals of Emma, to the photographs of the woman in white, to the simpering portraits despised by Dorothea in Middlemarch, I'm deliberately choosing inconspicuous examples. The critical presence of the aesthetic is a crucial and pervasive element, exploring not only itself, but the way people live. To end with, I'll look at the doll's dressmaker in Our Mutual Friend, who creates an art form out of waste and scraps, and where the aesthetic becomes a prompt to questioning. Disabled, assaulted by other children, she is a child-sweated labourer and member of the underclass, supporting an alcoholic father. Slave, slave, slave from morning to night, and all for this. Her dolls are differentiated by their designer garments. A dazzling semicircle of dolls, dressed for presentation at court, for going to balls, for going out driving, for going out on horseback, for going out walking, for going to get married, for going to help other dolls get married. Celebrity high life in miniature. Her work is both an art form and estranged labour. All my work, she says, scudding freely around London, and scud is the verb she uses, a wonderful verb. She invests imaginative energy in her work. Moreover, to her mind, her work inverts the class hierarchy which it appears to serve and actually instrumentalizes the rich. I am making a perfect slave of her, slavery again, with making her try on my doll's dress. when she cuts out and bastes, as she puts it, a grand lady and eyes the apparel of an aristocratic woman, they become completely subservient to her imagined doll's dress. Trying on is an imaginative practice that ruthlessly demythologizes class and fashion. That's Lady Belinda in the shop window, hanging up by the waist, much too near the gaslight for a wax one, with her toes turned in. Questions proliferate. Does the aesthetic, with its confounding of work and art, disguise a strange labour? What sort of autonomy is this, wrested from class hierarchy and exploitation? Is the doll's dressmaker the victim of the society of spectacle? We can see that these are the beginnings of the Barbie doll, aren't they? And commodity? Does creativity transcend the oppressions of labour and class? A Blake-like question. All these questions are elicited from the position of the doll's dressmaker. The doll's dressmaker has 4 names in addition to this one: Fanny Cleaver, Jenny Wren, the person of the house, Cinderella. And this last evokes a final question. The doll's dressmaker at last finds her prince in Sloppy, retrained as a cabinet maker. I'll tell you what, miss, I'd like to make you something. The 2 makers of the novel come together, and it's wonderful that the doll's dressmaker's paper patterns are different from the paper bonds that circulate in the novel. Is it possible, through the aesthetic and its representations, to escape the noose of class and gender exploitation, to live and love with use value? Those are my 4 principles. And to end with, I'll remind you that Chris Nealon has argued that we need to work with a wider definition of the political than the one we have when addressing literary texts. To live and love in freedom is something that literature is about. A definition that will restore energy and pleasure to analysis. And of course, I'll end by reminding you again of Adorno, a great work of art. Let those things be heard which ideology conceals. Thank you.